Welcome class to chapter 6 on learning a change in behavior resulting from experience, really a dissatisfaction with Freudian theory and a movement towards empiricism, led to behaviorism. They wanted to study things that can be observed directly, and that is the behavior and the environment. John Watson, a big proponent of behaviorism early on, behaviorism based a lot on the philosophy of John Locke and empiricism. The idea of that the infant's mind is a tabula rasa, and that a blank slate, and then through sensory experiences, the infant learns things, and that becomes knowledge. There are no innate or a priori structures in the mind, but purely through rewards, punishments, experiences through the world is our knowledge shaped. The environment and associated key effects as key determinants of learning. B.F. Skinner, another proponent of behaviorism, designed animal experiments to discover basic rules of learning, believed that free will is an illusion, that he was very much a determinist, and believed that the environment and the rewards and punishments that you've had in the past really determine your future choices. Human behavior is based on the consequences of previous actions. 3 ways we learn: non-associative learning, associative learning, and learning by watching others. The first 2 were the behaviorists, and the last one was Albert Bandura, as we'll go over in a little bit. Non-associative learning really as it says, it's not associated with anything per se, and then you learn that with that, as we're going to talk about with associative learning. Non-associative learning just has to do with a person learning information about one external stimulus, what something smells like, what something tastes like, what something looks like. A couple ideas around that area. Habituation is one. That's a decrease in behavioral response after lengthy or repeated exposure to the stimulus. The stimulus is neither harmful nor rewarding. We, of course, and animals, soon learn to ignore it. We ignore sounds in the environment that aren't going to harm us. For example, the sound of the refrigerator or something like that. Sensitization is an increase in behavioral response after lengthy or repeat exposure to the stimuli that has a potential for harm or reward. So, for example, you smell something burning, you will not habituate to it and ignore it. You will pay more attention to it to see if it gets worse, it increases, decreases. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from my house, or is it coming from the other house? Oh great, it's coming from the other house. Nothing to worry about. Associative learning, understanding how 2 or more pieces of information are related. Okay, so that's different than non-associative learning. This is associative learning, and then there's 2 aspects of associative learning. There is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, learn that 2 stimuli go together. For example, Jaws and the scary music that elicits anxiety when heard. It's like dun 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 dun. Or, of course, Pavlov's dog learning that the ring of the bell right before food comes out, and learns to salivate just with the ring of the bell. Operant conditioning, learn that a behavior leads to a particular outcome. For example, you study more in college, and then you end up getting better grades than when you didn't study, for example. That's the operant conditioning in action right there, that you're operating on the environment, you're doing something to the environment, and you're getting rewards or punishments. And if you get rewards, you're more likely to continue that. And if you get punishments, you're more likely to decrease that behavior. And then learning by watching others. Bandura, and there are 3 components of that: observational learning, modeling, and vicarious conditioning. Observational learning, of course, just sounds like it is when we learn a change of behavior after watching a person engage in that behavior. Modeling, imitating that behavior after seeing in others. And vicarious conditioning, learning to engage in behavior not after seeing others being rewarded or punished for performing that action. All 3 take part, whether we're coming up in grade school, or if we have siblings, for example. It's great to be able to see the younger kids just basically watch the older kids do stuff and then model that behavior, and it almost seems like they have an advantage in some ways and a disadvantage by being younger and stuff like that, because then you're always kind of feeling like you got someone that's kind of can beat you down or whatever, if it's a big brother or something like that. Vicarious conditioning, of course, is really nice too, because you can learn that, oh, look, my big brother did this, I better not do that in the future. And so hopefully you can become not as bad as your big brother, right, that beat you up or something like that. Hopefully that didn't happen, right? Or big sister for that matter. Not associative. This is the chart that shows all those things right there. And then I just like to test myself, so you can take a pause right now. Take a pause right now. I mean, test yourself. Do you know it? LTP, long-term potentiation. This is, the chapter, it's just intro to psych, so it's not covering a lot of stuff on learning per se, and we'll cover some stuff on memory, which is really interesting in the next chapter. But LTP is a really great idea here, and that's the strengthening of the synaptic connections between neurons. Evidence supports the idea that long-term potentiation is involved in learning and memory. When one neuron excites another, some change takes place that strengthens the connection between the two neurons. After that original event, the firing of one neuron becomes increasingly likely to cause the firing of another neuron. Basically, the changes that take place are an increase dendrites, increase receptors on the dendrites, increase sensitization of the receptors on the dendrites. All kinds of things that you just think of that just kind of strengthen that connection, okay? And that's learning. And so basically you're learning, oh, this thing goes along, this ring of the bell, the dog learns this ring of the bell goes along with the food. And that keeps on happening and keeps on happening. So there's basically these chemical connections and strengthening of connections that I was just talking about. And it's assigning weightings to these things, right? That's more than likely to happen. When I hear that bell, I get fed. Like, more than likely to happen, so heavy weightings. And then you do it over and over, and it becomes even more weighted, right? Versus other sounds that they learn to, say, oh, that's not it. Then all of a sudden, if you change the sound, and then they're like, oh, new sound, ooh, I gotta learn that. And so then they start processing that, and then the old sound kind of disappears, right? And then if you return back to that old sound, they might learn that quicker, so that's the idea of long-term potentiation. Just think of it as kind of things getting more glued, if you will, or less glued, and more connections to that become more glued, if you will. I don't know if it's glue is a good metaphor for that, but let us assume that the persistence or repetition of a reverberatory activity or trace tends to induce lasting cellular changes that add to its stability. When an axon of cell A is near enough to excite a cell B and repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing it, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells, such that A's efficiency as one of the cells firing B is increased. Okay, and that's called the Hebbian principle, that neurons that fire together wire together. Okay, so think of it as learning. You learn something initially, and there's like some neurochemical connections, and then you study it once, and then you forget it. But let's say you study it over and over. Now you're not only going to connect those neurochemical connections that are happening, but you're also going to increase these dendrite receptors and different things too, which is really going to strengthen it right there. And so that's the whole wiring together. More dendrites, more receptors, increased sensitization, stuff like that. Pavlov, Nobel Prize in 1904 for research on the digestive system, observed that dogs began to salivate as soon as they saw bowls of food. But then what else did he notice? He noticed that something else can happen too. So let's take a look at it. It's classical conditioning, a type of learned response in which a neutral object comes to elicit a response when it is associated with a stimulus that already produces a response. So what's the neutral object? The metronome. Unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus just means learned. Unconditioned stimulus, unlearned. Unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits a response that is innate, does not require any prior learning. Food, do we salivate for food? Heck yeah, we do. That's innate, okay? That's kind of funny, right? Innate, oh, there's something that's innate, a priori. Mr. Behaviorist, okay, they give way to instincts, stuff like that, but not learning per se. Well, they add stuff to it. Unconditioned response, a response that does not have to be learned, such as a reflex salivation, okay? So not learned, stimulus, response. Food, salivation. Unconditioned stimulus, food. Unconditioned response, salivation. Step 2, click the metronome and doesn't salivate because metronomes do not make, evolutionary-wise speaking, dogs salivate. They're not very yummy. Okay, conditioning trial starts. So basically now the neutral stimulus is presented, neutral stimulus right here, along with the unconditioned stimulus that produces the salivation, right? And the dog begins to associate, right, the unconditioned stimulus, food, and the neutral stimulus. So they pair those together in their mind. They say, oh, this means I'm going to get fed, right? And so the stimulus that once was a neutral stimulus now becomes a conditioned stimulus. Metronome alone without food makes the dog salivate. Conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits a response only after learning has taken place. Conditioned response, a response to a conditioned stimulus, a response that has been learned. So basically, of course, condition means what? Now the metronome has been conditioned, you're conditioning the dog to think, oh, I'm going to get fed. So the dog salivates now to the metronome when before it was neutral, right? So he has learned it. It's conditioned. It's a conditioned stimulus. And the response, the conditioned response, is the response he salivates to the metronome now. Da-da-da! Very simplified, but they use these terms here. But just remember, unconditioned means unlearned, right? Conditioned means learned. Neutral is something that doesn't make you salivate, for example, right? But once it becomes conditioned, a conditioned stimulus versus a neutral stimulus, it makes you salivate, okay? So because you know, I'm gonna get fed, it's dinner time. Okay, so test yourself. Take a pause, test yourself. Okay, there you go. There's the answers. Right. Animals adapt via conditioning. Learning to predict outcomes leads to new adaptive behaviors. So here's some more ideas here. Acquisition, the gradual formation of an association between conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. Pavlov presents stimuli at the same time, metronome and food, but current research shows strongest conditioning occurs when the metronome is presented slightly before the unconditioned stimulus. So you got a clicker, you know, you're training your dog. You don't want to feed your dog every time, so you give click and then throw the food. Click, then throw the food. Don't throw the food, click, same time. Click, then throw the food. Okay? Got it. Okay. Extinction, how do you want to get rid of a behavior? So you can learn a behavior, you can acquire it, acquisition, and you can extinguish it, a process in which the conditioned response salivation is weakened when the conditioned stimulus, the metronome, is repeated without the food. Okay, so they learn no food, no salivation anymore, right? Through extinction, the animal learns the original association no longer holds true. Spontaneous recovery, mentioned this earlier, process in which previously extinguished response salivation reemerges after the conditioned stimulus metronome is presented again. So they learn it a little bit quicker, right? Can occur only after one pairing. Response will weaken if the metronome food pairings do not continue. So it's just weightings, right? Different weightings, right? Oh, am I getting food or sound of metronome? Food, yes. Oh yes, heavy weightings, right? And then you start not giving it to me, I'd be like, what's up with that? Maybe it doesn't give me that anymore, you know, something else, whatever. And then you get the food with the metronome, and you're like, oh, maybe it is. And so you're weighting it back again. Generalization, discrimination, and second order conditioning. Let's take a look at these. Stimulus generalization, learning that occurs when stimuli are similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus, produce the conditioned response. This is the idea of little Albert. They paired the loud noise with rats, and then with rabbits, and then from then on, all white and fluffy objects, okay? So that's the idea that, you know, fears can be gained from different things that just remind you of the situation, right? And so that's the idea of stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination, differentiation between two similar stimuli. Stimular stimuli, that was like almost a spoonerism there. Similar stimuli, when only one of them, try and say that fast 5 times, only one of them is consistently associated with the unconditioned stimulus. And I give the idea of poison oak, and blackberry, right there. And you can, once you get stung or get poison oak and you're all itchy, you definitely can determine the difference between that and some other stuff, or hopefully you do, and remember that. Second order conditioning, conditioned stimulus becomes associated with the first conditioned stimulus and elicits the conditioned response when presented alone. They give the idea in the book of research of a black square being presented with the metronome, and then the metronome removed and the dog salivated the black square alone. So there's multiple things that the brain's paying attention to as what's associated with some grub highs. So it's good, right? Because you can remember, when you're fly fishing way back in the day, what little fly you use at what particular time to catch those fish, right? And because they're very picky. And you got to eat, right? If you're eating fish, for example. I mentioned little Albert. We're talking about phobias here. Acquired fear that is very strong comparison to the threat of an object or situation. In the case of little Albert, classically conditioned demonstrated in phobias, or classical conditioning demonstrated in phobias. Watson showed little Albert various neutral objects, white rat, rabbit, dog, monkey, white wool, and wasn't scared of it, but then paired the rat with a loud clanging noise until the rat alone produced the fear, and that's the conditioned response. Fear generalized to all other similar stimuli. Got it right that time. Counter conditioning exposing subjects to phobia during an enjoyable task. And so you can see how these things now of behaviorism are applied therapeutically, right? And the idea here is in systematic desensitization, type of counter conditioning involving exposure to the fear stimulus while relaxing and chilling. So you're scared of a rat, for example, you're little Albert or Bunny, and then you get chill out and you get presented with like a fluffy pet or a fluffy animal, stuffed animal or whatever, and then eventually like a real animal, and then while you're like relaxing, and then you're taught to relax muscles and deep breathe and that type of stuff. Pavlov's belief any two events presented together would produce learned association. By the 1960s, data suggested that some conditioned stimuli were more likely to produce learning than others. There are evolutionary influences. Certain pairings are more likely to be associated. There are conditioned taste aversions, easy to produce with smell or taste cues, and that's because it has a survival value, not eat something poisonous, right? Monkeys are conditioned to respond more fearfully to snakes versus flowers and rabbits. And cognitive influences. Through classical conditioning, animals come to learn how to predict events. Some stimuli are better predictors than others. Rescorla conducted one of the first studies that highlighted the role of cognition in learning. Easier when the conditioned stimulus precedes the unconditioned stimulus rather than following it, and we talked about that just a little bit earlier ago. And easier when the conditioned stimulus is more unexpected or surprising. So that's the idea of don't kick it down all the time. Like, reward that dog every time for sitting. Don't reward him. Give him the click maybe. And he's like, what's up? Did I not do that sit very good? I'm going to do it better next time so I can get the food with that. Right? There's something about that expectation or building that expectation that is better than the actual food. Really? Perhaps. Okay, and then there's some discrimination there. Classical conditioning is a passive process learned by association regardless of our behaviors. Behaviors are instrumental. We do them for a purpose. We learn that behaving in certain ways helps us to achieve desired outcomes. For example, studying leads to good grades. And so this is the idea, instead of classical conditioning, of operant conditioning. How are we operating on the environment? It's a type of associative learning where we learn the relationship between a behavior and its consequences, rewards or punishments, in which the consequences of an action determine the likelihood that that action will be performed in the future, right? Get rewarded for something, more likely to perform in the future. Get punished for something, less likely to perform it, unless you are like a masochist or something like that. Okay, Thorndike's experiments basically threw a cat in a box, and basically the trapdoor, as soon as the cat figured it out, animal quickly learned that you could press a lever, it got out, then you put him back in the box. What's he going to do? He's going to press the lever real quick to go get that food, right? And so law of effect, any behavior that leads to a satisfying state of affairs is likely to occur. an annoying state of affairs is less likely to occur. Okay, and there's Thorndike's box. Kitty getting out, right? Smart kitties, right? They want that food. We have Skinner's learning theory based on the law of effect. Animals operate on environments to produce effects, and chose the term operant, right? And then the idea of a reinforcer, that's a stimulus that occurs after a response and increases the likelihood of a response reoccurring. Behavior occurs because it is reinforced. That's funny. A masochist is someone who wants to take a cold shower but takes a warm one instead. And a sadist is someone who, if the masochist said, hit me, would say, no way. And there's the Skinner box. Press lever, get food. Gonna press lever. Press lever, get shocked. No pressing the lever. Okay. Shaping, how you can teach a dog to surf, right? You reward them for little things that are kind of like it and, you know, approximate them to it. Once they do it, you're like, yeah, super duper, right? Got to work with them over time. Primary reinforcers necessary for survival, like food or water. Secondary reinforcers is the idea of like money or something. These are objects that serve as reinforcers but not satisfy biological needs. And we won't repeat that one. Reinforcer potency, the Premack principle. This is the idea that more valued activity can reinforce less valued activity. An example is you eat your spinach, then you get to get dessert or something like that. And this kind of just shows the difference when positive and negative and then reinforcement or punishment. And remember, with positive and negative, it just means the stimulus is added or taken away. And with reinforcement versus punishment, reinforcement, you're trying to increase a behavior. Punishment, you're trying to decrease a behavior. Okay? So this is going to hopefully simplify things right here. When we go over positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, what? Positive punishment, seems like an oxymoron, and negative punishment. All right? Positive, negative, add or take away the stimulus. Reinforcement, increase the behavior. Punishment, decrease the behavior. Reinforcement and punishment have opposite effects on behavior. Reinforcement, behavior more likely to be repeated. Punishment, of course, behavior less likely to occur again. Let's take a look at positive and negative reinforcement. Both positive and negative reinforcement increase likelihood of a given behavior, right? Because it is reinforcement, right? Punishment, decrease behavior. Let's increase the behavior here. How are we going to do it? Give them something, positive reinforcement, the addition of a desirable stimulus to increase the probability the behavior will be repeated. If you do your homework, then you get to go out with your friends. The desirable stimulus is going out with your friends. Negative reinforcement, how are we going to increase this behavior? We're going to remove an aversive stimulus, okay, to increase the behavior. Example, if you do your homework, you don't have to do the dishes. If you click your seatbelt, the ringing will stop. Ding, 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 ding. Negative reinforcement, click it. All right, so reinforcement, increase behavior, increase clicking seatbelt, get rid of, remove stimulus, noxious stimulus. Positive reinforcement, get tokens or kick down some candy when you do this awesome activity, or stickers, whatever. Positive and negative punishment. What? Both positive and negative punishment reduce likelihood that the behavior will be repeated, right? You want to decrease that behavior, get rid of the behavior. Positive punishment, the addition of an aversive stimulus to decrease behavior. This is spanking, right? Electrical shock to stop a behavior of a mouse, let's say, pressing the lever. Pay a ticket to stop you from speeding. Spanking to stop a kid from hitting his brother. Okay, does that make sense? I don't know. Negative punishment, response, cost is another word for that, also known as the removal of a desirable stimulus to decrease the behavior. Example, be lazy, don't get your homework done, then you can't go out with your friends. All right? So I'm going to force you to get that stuff done, right? And so that's the idea there. I'm not going to decrease you being lazy and increase you doing your homework. I know it's kind of like, oh, which one is it? You know, it's like opposite of saying the same thing. But in this case, you're going to decrease them being lazy, and you're going to remove the going out with friends for that, and it's called response. So remove a desirable stimulus to decrease the behavior of laziness. I think I got it there. Continuous reinforcement, behavior is reinforced each time it occurs. Partial reinforcement behavior is occasionally reinforced. Which is better? It depends. Life, it depends, right? You know, to every question. What's the answer to this question, Prof? It depends. Okay, fixed interval, variable interval. This is all both based on time. This is a predictable basis. Quiz every other class. Variable, pop quiz, right? Fixed ratio, variable ratio. This has to do with the number of responses. Fixed ratio, you get buy 9 coffees, you get the 10th for free. And variable ratio, it's like a slot machine. You never know how many quarters you got to put in until you get paid, right? People like that? They do. Partial reinforcement, extinction effect. Behavior lasts longer under partial reinforcement than under continuous reinforcement. So that's the idea. If you don't feel like dealing with it, don't give in once to your kids when they whine for candy at the store. You're setting yourself up for future problems that are now reinforced. It's harder to extinguish. To condition a behavior to persist, you want to use continuous reinforcement initially and then slowly change to partial reinforcement. So you want to try and get them to start a behavior, you reward them each time. Don't make them question, like, wait, is this behavior, like, you know, gonna give me that? No. Boom, 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 right? Then you reward people all the time. They get lazy. They have issues with intrinsic motivation, right? So you don't want to like kick them down that and make them think, oh, the only time I'm going to do this is just to get that reward, right? So, and then you make them question, you know, like the dog's like sitting down. Did I really sit good enough? Next time I'm going to do that even better. And that's the idea. That's what I think, at least what's going on. Punishment's not the best strategy to shape or extinguish behaviors. If it is used, it must be reasonable, unpleasant, applied immediately, and clearly connected to the unwanted behavior. Check out that quote by B.F. Skinner. Very true. Punishment can cause potential confusion, and here's a lot of problems with it. Wrongly applied after a desirable behavior. Child tells the truth about cheating, is punished, so learns not to tell the truth. Leads to negative emotions associated with the caretaker. Fails to offset reinforcing aspects of the undesired behavior. For example, thumb sucking provides relief from negative emotions. Feels good, eases hunger. Reinforcement is a much better way than punishment to teach kids, or teach desirable behaviors. And spanking leads to a lot of issues: poor parent-child relations, weaker moral values, mental health problems, increased delinquency, future child abuse. BMOD, use of operant conditioning techniques to eliminate unwanted behaviors and replace them with desirable ones. Hey, check out the token economy and the idea of that for BMOD, behavior mod. Excuse me. Behaviorists believe conditioning principles explain all behavior. In reality, reinforcement explains only a certain amount of human behavior. There are also biological factors. We talked about some of those evolutionary factors earlier, right? That can increase or limit the effects of reinforcers on learning. Reinforcement does not always have to be present for learning to occur, as we'll see in the study upcoming here. Positive reinforcement provides the subjective experience of pleasure and increases the desire of object or event that produced the pleasure. Hungry rats given food, that increases the release of dopamine in the reward regions of the brain. The more the hunger, the greater the release of dopamine. Dopamine activity affects reinforcement. And so here's the idea of some biological factors, right? Drugs that block dopamine's effect disrupt operant conditioning. Drugs that enhance dopamine increase the reinforcing value of the stimuli. So one could use that perhaps with certain drugs to block those reward effects, right? And then they won't want to take the drug. They'll find something else to take the drug. Biology constrains reinforcement. Some animal behaviors hardwired. Difficult to learn behaviors counter to evolutionary adaptation. Raccoons taught to store coins in a bank stopped doing it and began rubbing the coins. Is this what they do for food? Conditioning most effective when matched to the animal's biological predispositions. Pigeons can peck a key for food, but not to avoid shock. But they can be trained to avoid shock using wings, because this is what they do when they avoid things, is they use their wings and not peck at things, right? So you kind of have to go with how the animal is hardwired, you know, versus like kind of like pushing a river, right? You can't push a river, is the idea there. And that's the idea, that there's innate genetic influences, and you got to work with them, right, if you're going to train that raccoon or pigeon. Learning without reinforcement, Tolman argued that reinforcement impacts performance more than knowledge acquisition, and ran rats through complex mazes to obtain food. And came with the idea that there's a cognitive map, a visual spatial mental representation of the environment. And we'll take a look at this in the next slide with the research. But let's see it, because basically what he's saying, that the reinforcement is going to increase their performance, but not necessarily reinforcement has to do with knowledge acquisition. So that's a key point there, and we're going to see it. So Tolman studied rats, and he basically, in group 1, he didn't give them any reinforcements and made them run through a maze, right? And then the group 2, reinforcement every trial, and group 3, reinforcement only after the first 10 trials. And let's see what happened. In terms of average errors, group 1, really, they improved a little bit, but when they got to the end of the maze, there was no food. So they're like, dude, why am I going to perform? And then group 3, which is right here, the red one, they were running along the same as group 1, right? They're like, no food, why should I perform? But then they started hooking them up with food, right, at day 11. And look what happened. They made less errors than the group that was consistently hooked up with food. So what does that say? It says what he says in that second slide before, which is that reinforcement impacts performance, not knowledge acquisition. So they were learning the whole time, but they were like, Jerry Maguire said, show me the money, right? Oh, that's an old one. You guys probably don't know that one. But anyway, they were like, show me the cheese, and then I'll perform. The idea that there's latent learning. Learning takes place in the absence of reinforcement. And there's also insight learning, a sudden understanding of how to solve a problem after a period of either inaction or thinking about the problem. And that's the idea that you've seen with chimps, where they kind of chill for a second and then they figure out, oh, insight, I can get to it this way by putting some things together or some boxes together. Bandura and social learning theory. Let's see where we're at. We'll probably leave it right there with that. But basically, it's going to go over the Bobo doll and observational learning, modeling, and vicarious conditioning. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll see you next week.